people that are watching from your channel, I'm Carl. I'm also a singing coach. I kind of got some unique ideas, and then some unique ideas that are a bit more traditional. And I generally came at this originally from as somebody that wanted to sing, who was a guitar player who was struggling, and also had done quite a lot of other things. So I came into it as a young adult, really with a kind of blank slate and not really knowing much, and spent about 5 to 10 years sucking. And then gradually, probably over the last 2 or 3 years, I've started to get a bit better. And this year, I've kind of started to get a lot better with my coaching and with my own stuff. Gradually, this year's been a big transition for me. So it's kind of been this journey of going into coaching from there, really, of dealing with my own struggles and then trying to help other people. But I've had very little help in the sense of speaking to other coaches, interacting with other coaches, and it's just been right. Go figure out how to do this job. Do you want to introduce yourself? And
Sure. So I'm
okay.
Caryn O'Connor. A lot of people know me from my website, SingWise.com. And yeah, I started out teaching. Well, this is how it happened. So I started doing some informal vocal coaching for an amateur theater company that I was involved with. I had done some acting, both traditional and musical theater. And I had just kind of somehow gravitated toward the role of just helping others with their voices. And then I didn't do anything with that for the next decade plus, few years, I think, beyond that. And at that time, I was focusing primarily on my own performance career. And I was leading worship around Ontario and the northern part of the US. And I was involved with a band, and we were playing a lot of my original music, and I was singing at concerts and opening for other bands and really focusing more on my performance career. And then I got married and had a child. And then at that point, it just became something that kind of fell into my lap a little bit. There was a music store. I live in a small town, and there was a music store that had opened up just about a year earlier. And I was very curious about it, but had never gone in because I had a new baby, and things get busy. And so one day I finally said, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to ask them about their voice program, just out of curiosity. And so I walked into the store and I said, hey, do you guys have a singing teacher? And I think there was a little seed planted at that point. I think there was a little something already there that was saying, you should do this. Because at that point, I had done a lot of tutoring in academic subjects. And so I was kind of a teacher by nature. And the owner of the store explained to me that they had had a singing teacher who had left the state. And so they'd been without one for a few months. And he had a list of people waiting for lessons. And I said, can I apply? So I said to my application, I said, I really don't have a lot of teaching experience, but I have a lot of training and a lot of performing experience. And I stayed there for 2 years. I did get hired, and I worked with, there's my phone. So yeah, I worked with a lot of younger students, which isn't really what I tend to do now. I tend to work with later teens and adults, but stayed there for 2 years. And then I decided that it was time to kind of branch out and just really build my own private studio. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And it was a really good shift because now I have a lot more control, I think, over the types of students that come into my studio. And not that I take students of any level. I love working with absolute beginners. They're actually some of the best students to work with because they have so much that they can accomplish and so much to really work on. And you really see that improvement from week to week. Love that. But yeah, I get to not teach the 9 and 10-year-olds.
Yeah. Did you start singing from a young age then?
Not really. It's interesting. So I was an athlete. I was a competitive gymnast up until I was 16, and I didn't really do much singing before that. We didn't have any school choirs, so I didn't participate in any of that. I had done a little bit of, singing. I liked singing, but it wasn't really, I didn't have lessons early on. I didn't start lessons until I was 19, until I was in university.
Hmm.
And that's when I became a little bit more serious. So I had a little bit of a later start than a lot. When I retired from gymnastics at 16, I had a bunch of injuries and knee problems. I I was at a Bible study, a youth Bible study, and somebody heard me singing some of the songs that we were singing, and he said, "Oh, you have a really nice voice. You should get up and sing in front of the church sometime." I'm like, "No." Okay, maybe I'll do it if you join me and two others. So we ended up forming a teen quartet when I think I was 17 at the time, or close to 17. And that's how it kind of started. And I wouldn't say I was a natural singer. I could hold a tune. My voice wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it was breathy. And, I had a limited range. I didn't really have much in the way of real head voice, limited chest range, no real mix in my voice, but it wasn't an unpleasant voice. And so I kind of made do with it. And I sang in that teen quartet pretty much just about every Sunday. And we sang at a few other churches as well in the area. But yeah, that's how I started. But I really had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I liked to sing. And then how I got into lessons was I was performing Jesus Christ Superstar in that amateur theater company. And the person who was playing the role of Jesus, I was just so incredibly impressed by his voice. I mean, he had the long hair, he sang in a heavy metal band, and he was doing these amazing, he had the distortion in his voice when he needed it for the role, and then he could sing this super clean, beautiful tone. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I inquired one day, I said, well, what? Do you take lessons?
It's like another
and
world.
It just so happened that I was going to university that fall in Toronto, and that's where his teacher was. And so that's how I ended up meeting my teacher, was through him. I just heard it. I was like, oh my goodness, I want to study with your teacher. And that was the first time I think I really said, I want to get serious about this.
Yeah, that mirrors actually very similar to myself. I was kind of doing a little bit of singing, and for quite a while, it wasn't until I happened to just bump into a young guy at an open mic night in London, who was just a very good singer, and it it can kind of blow your mind a bit the first time you experience that, and all of a sudden everything feels different. And from there, I decided I really wanted to sing. And ever since then, I've always had that kind of drive. It's almost like I fell in love in a sense. Yeah, it's interesting. So you kind of came at it as a teenager. Also, you were saying about the gymnastics. I think maybe that's why we've got some common ground here a little bit, because I came from a kind of sporting background. Not one particular sport, but numerous sports I did as I was growing up. And a lot of that skill set that I developed in terms of motor skills and understanding how they work and how to get better at them, a lot of that stuff I just translated into singing. And a lot of that stuff I've kind of argued over the years is sometimes missing from some coaches, is they don't talk enough about just developing motor skills and understanding the process that is. And obviously as an adult, sometimes as singers, we are having motor skills that aren't very efficient and having to kind of pick away at those and undo them, whilst just trying to establish something new and that's more predictable and more efficient. And that kind of mechanical process that struggling singers go through, which I find really deeply interesting, because I was already a musician when I came into singing. I was talking about this with a guy called Martin recently on another video I did. But I came into it as a musician, and so I had all of the artistry already there, and what I wanted to do in my head, but technically I couldn't execute it. So a lot of my journey was just learning the mechanics over and over again until they got easier for me. Some singers come in without that so much of a musical background, so they have a lot of other challenges that I kind of took for granted a little bit because I was already a guitar player. Some of my easiest students tend to be people that were already musicians, because they're dealing with all the stuff I did, and they've got a lot less of the stuff that I don't know about as much. Yeah.
Well, I find that sometimes with musicians, they make the best students also because they understand the discipline that it takes to practice. And they tend to have a much better perspective on learning to sing because they understand, they remember those days when they started off being able to play 2 chords. And they remember those days when they didn't have the calluses on their fingertips and it hurt, and they had to build that, and they remember fumbling, and so they don't come into voice training with that unrealistic expectation that they're going to be able to just do these amazing advanced skills immediately.
Yeah,
And those are sometimes the best students because they understand that it takes time and self-discipline.
yeah, and that there's a process behind it, and that usually with all of the singers that we see, most people day to day, not voice teachers who see all the struggling singers in that spectrum. Most people are just seeing that tiny 1% of singers who are professional and who are at a very high level, and they've missed everything before that, so they don't have this broader perspective that coaches have or that other musicians have when they learn and they understand the process of going from, day one all the way through to being good at what they do.
And I think there's that assumption as well that that 1% are just natural singers and that they never really had to work at it. It just came like that for them. It was automatic and they didn't have to go through all that work. And I think those individuals for whom it does come very easily and naturally are exceptions to the rules. A lot of those singers that we see, even if they haven't had formal lessons, had to still figure things out. They still had to put in the work and the time and the daily discipline of practice.
Yeah, and even the ones who get it young, say, Adele or singers like that, or or Matt Corby's another good example. They will have still done a lot of years of singing before they got to the point when they were good. It's just that they got such a head start, starting at 6, 7 years old and singing, or 8 years old, singing for 6, 7 years at that age. Seriously, it's like such a lot of time. There's always a story behind everybody. It's like, but you're right. They just see that little end result and they kind of don't see beyond that. Hang on, like, what did they grow up? Like Whitney Houston grew up singing in church. Her auntie, her mum were both serious singers, like singing in front of people all the time, growing up around great singers. Like, that platform is utterly different to, some kid who's very quiet and introverted in his bedroom, not, maybe doesn't hardly ever sing at all, maybe does play a bit of guitar, but then they get to 19, 20 and they go to decide to sing. Like, that starting point is absolutely different to somebody like a Whitney Houston or another singer like that. But people don't necessarily understand. There's always a story with everybody. Right, let's cover some of these topics that I've written down, because some of them, particularly this first one, has resonated with me a lot recently, in particular this year. And you happened to make a video mentioning about it, and I really wanted to just talk about it a little bit, because it's helping me to teach better. It's helping me with my own singing, and I felt like it was good common ground, and I think it's really so key for struggling singers to get this. But the idea is understanding, or talking about really what it is to sing within your ability or sing within your skill level. My history as a singer was I had tons of ambition and very little skill. And so when I started singing, I was singing way beyond what I really was capable of. And probably 80 to 90% of it was kind of pushed and difficult and sounded straining and irritating, frankly, to people. I always kind of played the long game, in the sense that I thought, well, if I just keep pushing out into that horrible area, like, eventually I'll figure it out. And there was some truth to that. But also this year in particular, and even in the last couple of months, I've realized that if I'm singing within the rules, if the sound that I'm producing is free and relaxed and easy, not necessarily that I'm not working for it, but that effort's very focused and in the right spot, people latch onto it much more, and it affords me a little bit of room for mistakes. But the margins that I'm working within now are a lot kind of stricter in that sense. Like, I'm not pushing my voice beyond what the technique is allowing, the skill level in my technique, and I've got a much kind of better sense of, right, this is what I've got to work within. And every time I go out of that, I can do it a little bit here and there, but anything that's too far for too long, people will be like, They just, something grates with them, and it doesn't connect with them emotionally as much as when I'm working within the rules. So I kind of wanted to ask you, I guess, like, what do you think, how could you explain what these rules are, or singing within your ability, or singing within your skill level? Like, how do you start to understand that? Because with the sound, it's not something objective that you can say, right, when you go beyond that, it's right or wrong. You can, as you understand what you're doing, but it's hard to define what is beyond your ability and what isn't, especially for learning and intermediate singers. I think this is so difficult for them. So, like, have you got any ideas about that?
I do. It's kind of a tricky answer, I think, because it's so multifaceted. I kind of approached my own early singing very differently from how you're describing your early singing. I always played it very safe. I never pushed the boundaries. I never pushed the envelope at all in terms of my technique. I just kind of sang we'll say how I naturally sang. I took lessons to improve some of the tone, got rid of the breathiness, expanded my range, but I never really challenged myself, I think. And I think that I, for a very, very long time, underestimated what my voice is capable of. And that, I think, so we're kind of on opposite ends there, because I think some people do it. I think some of it's personality as well. Some people do really push, and they have ideas about where they want to be. And so they just keep pushing for that. Whether they're doing it correctly or not in a safe or healthy manner is another story. But, and then there are those singers who are on this end, sorry, my voice, who are like me, who are just introverted by nature, shy, kind of reserved, very much afraid to make sounds that are unpleasant, afraid to really explore what our voices are fully capable of doing. That's where I sat for many, many years. I sang what was easy. I sang what I knew and I could trust my voice to do. And then it wasn't until, I'm always kind of a late bloomer, but it wasn't until many years later, in my 40s, that I realized, like, what do I have to lose, by challenging my voice further? I have a healthy instrument. It's an instrument that's capable. And I went about it intelligently, though. I went about growing my chest voice and learning to belt, but I didn't just kind of go at it full force without kind of gradually building up to that and being very wise in the steps that I took to get me there. And that's, I think, that's the really important thing. I think that we shouldn't underestimate our abilities, but we also shouldn't overestimate them. We have to have a reasonable, accurate assessment of our current skill level, and then build our technique from that launching point. Because if we skip ahead, that's when we get into that danger zone. That's when we risk injuring ourselves or doing something incorrectly. And that, I think, where a good singing teacher really comes in, because the singing teacher can provide that accurate assessment, that evaluation, and give you the right stepping stones to get you there.
Yeah, they're in a much better position to see where you're at, because going back to what we were saying earlier, they see so many voices that they've got a broader perspective on things typically. I like what you said about accurate self-assessment, because I think that is such a key thing. Many times I've had this sense of where I thought I was, and then I've got overly confident and realised I'm not there. And then I've had to take a bit of a fall and come back and build up my confidence again. That's happened to me over and over again for many years. And each time I do get a bit closer to what I really am capable of, but I feel like it's this relationship where I drift off and then I reset, and I drift off and reset. And it's usually a case that I'll have a run of bad shows and I will just think, man, this is not working. So about a year ago, I did a show. A girl who I was quite attracted to was there, and the show was just a bit of a mess, really. And that one really shook me up and made me realise I've still got something I've not figured out here. And this year, over the last 2 or 3 months, I had a couple of things where I just felt the same way, and each time I kind of come back with a healthier perspective on things, but it's so easy to drift off and go too far one way or the other. And the other thing I liked about what you said is people's nature. I completely agree. I think some people's some people, their nature is, like you say, they are more risk averse, they are a little bit more apprehensive about branching out into new areas. And conversely, some characters are a lot more willing to take risks and push the boundaries, which can lead them to sing way beyond their ability and sing abusively, or even just sing in a way that is not going to be that receptive to people. Like I've sung it a lot of the time where probably half of what I was singing was okay, and the other half it wasn't really abusive, but it was just not done very well. And because it wasn't executed very well, people don't really connect with it as much as they do when I execute it more consistently throughout. And so yeah, I'm probably, in that sense, I'm relatively central, but I also kind of think this is on average something that I see more typically in men pushing too far, and then the opposite with the girls. I'd say on average, obviously there are exceptions, but yeah, I see a lot more. I see a lot more guys with my particular voice issues, and the types of strain that I have, and the types of just pushing too far and singing badly too much, than I do with the girls. And I guess I'm kind of, I'm saying that really as much based on my coaching, but also just based on seeing a lot of average singers at open mics over the years. We're generalizing obviously here, and it's, you know, it comes down to individuals, but it starts to get interesting when you start breaking it down in that way, because then you can start, you know, really thinking about people's nature and how it can impact their singing and how it can impact their learning process and things like that. I've found as a person, it's forced me to become more balanced in my character, learning to sing, because I've had to learn to take my time. I've had to learn to just be a little bit more careful in what I'm doing, and a bit more methodical, and take smaller steps, and all these things that I would never have learned if I hadn't have sung. So I always, these days, I feel like it's a great journey to go on learning to sing, because it can teach you so much about other people and about life in general. And I think a lot of knowledge that is just, I don't know where else you'd learn it, frankly. You know, I don't know where else I'd have learned some of this stuff if I wasn't a singing teacher or I wasn't a singer. Do you know what I mean?
Right. I think, I don't know if it was the word that you used, but rules. You asked me at the beginning of this segment, you know, the rules. And I think for you approach the rules a little differently. You have to kind of go backwards a little bit and say, okay, these are the rules, and then I can go forward. And for me, I feel like that gives me a sense of security, knowing the rules and knowing how the body is designed to function. That's a big thing for me, is working with that natural design and not against it. That's huge for me. And understanding more and more of the science, for me, I'm very nerdy, understanding the science of mixed voice and belting and all of these aspects, and twang, and understanding that, for me, helps me to feel that sense of, okay, I can trust my instrument because it's designed to do this. And as long as, you know, I've worked my way up gradually, that those rules give me a sense of security. They give me a sense of confidence that I can do this because my body's designed to, and I can do it safely and not going to hurt myself, even though I'm asking a lot more of my instrument than I've ever asked of it before.
Yeah, yeah. And I think some people learn those rules intuitively as they grow up without lessons necessarily, and other people, you know, will depend more on somebody else to give them a sense of those guidelines and rules. And then you get singers who are kind of straddling that middle ground where they've got, you know, 90% of their technique is amazing, and then they will push things into territory where you think, oh, that might hurt you in the long term, but they're closer to the extreme. They're closer to that balance of like what's possible, even if they push it a little bit too far, which I think can be a better spot to be in than you know, too far either way, where you know you've got everything's safe, everything's quiet, everything is sounds one way, or you know everything is abusive, everything's pushed.
So
So
for many years, I painted with broad strokes. For many,
mm,
many years, I had my sound, and I might have used a little bit of, vocal fry at the start of a phrase or something, but I didn't really venture very much. And I feel like I didn't really let my emotions direct my phrasing, for example,
mm,
and so I got by. I mean, I got gigs. I, so I was hired again at the same places. And so I wasn't terrible, but I feel like now, these years later, just also as I've gotten older and started to become a lot more comfortable in my own skin, and a lot more, again, feeling I'm at that point where I'm like, what do I have to lose, by just really pouring so much more of myself and taking that intensity that's inside me that I don't tend to show very much, and just pouring that into my voice. And um, that for me has been kind of liberating, I think, on some levels. It's just learning to be able to paint with those smaller, finer strokes,
mm.
and being able to really think more about the choices that I'm making artistically, because now I have that technique in place. But before, playing it safe was all about those broad strokes and all about just kind of getting through, and sort of status quo almost. But it wasn't really getting me to becoming the artist that I wanted to be. And that all the other singers that I heard that just moved me so much, I'm like, well, why am I not like that? And it took me a long time to figure that out. Like, it really did.
Yeah, it's weird to think about some of this, because I think part of it comes down to this. It's like a lot of the what people misunderstand sometimes is a lot of the real, like, powerful stuff we get from singers is really connecting with emotions that are quite primal and quite could be quite aggressive or very vulnerable or whatever it is, but they're not typically they're typically emotions and actions that are probably outside of what we would typically be expecting of ourselves in day-to-day life. So when we're in our day-to-day life, everything's quite controlled, everything's quite safe. We have social norms and all this stuff constraining a lot of those instincts and those feelings that we have. As singers at a high level, the idea is that really you're going way beyond a lot of those social norms in a setting that is acceptable. Just like we see this in sport as well, it's the same really in one sense, is you're going way out, quite a long way outside of what would be considered socially acceptable in a normal situation, but on the stage in that situation all of a sudden it's acceptable to be expressing and emoting in that way. Just like, you see young kids and they will be screaming and shouting aggressively like at their parents, and that's normal for them. They haven't learned the social norm. They haven't learned all of that stuff, that the cultural stuff that will inhibit a lot of that. And I see singing in the same way. If you think about some of the sounds that great singers make, if they were angry and making some of those sounds just in a different scenario, just in public, screaming in someone's face, you would be like, this guy's a maniac. Do you know
Right.
what I mean? And so it's this funny thing, because obviously we use our voice all the time, so we get so used to working within those boundaries, and then someone's saying to you, well, actually within singing, those boundaries aren't so concrete. In fact, it's often desirable that we take those boundaries and just disregard them completely. If you can do it healthily and consistently, and it feels safe and it sounds nice, well, it doesn't sound nice, it sounds right, I guess you would say, rather than nice, because some sounds won't be necessarily nice sounding, but they're healthy to make. Then those sounds might be desirable because they're emoting something, and that's really what connects people with singers, is that feeling of something emotionally strong coming out of somebody that you don't see if you're just walking down the street. Yeah, I like what you've said there. It's really good. Um, what have we got here? Right, I had singing within your skill and ability. Yeah, you used this word independence in one of your videos I was watching recently, but I wanted to just cover this. Is learning muscle group independence, like what it means, why it's important, and why singing scales can be kind of is a useful tool in this particular regard. I don't know if you want me to start with that or you want to jump right in. It's completely up to you.
I can start, it's fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do speak a lot of independence of function between the various components of the vocal instrument. The vocal instrument does overall, function as a unity. It's a functional unity. We have that tripartite system with the motor, the breath, and the vibrator, the vocal fold vibration, and then the resonator, our supraglottal vocal tracts, right? And it has to operate as one, I guess, well-oiled machine. There's definitely an interdependence amongst the various parts, but at the same time, we have to be really, really mindful that each part, even though it's acting as part of the whole, is doing its own job independently of other parts. I always talk about, I've had done several videos, I can't talk. I've recorded several videos on the topic of that independence of function, specifically between the tongue and the jaw and the larynx, because those three parts are all interconnected via muscular attachment. So we have the hyoid bone from which the larynx suspends and into which the base of the tongue connects. And then at the base of the tongue, there are muscular attachments to the jaw. And so if one of those parts is misbehaving somehow, if there's excessive tension, if it's being mispositioned, we'll say, if it's in a bad posture, then that's going to have a direct impact on one of those other parts. And it can create a really bad snowball effect all the way down the voice system. Because then once you start having, let's say, the tongue root is depressing, pushing down on the larynx. Now the larynx is inflexible. It's unable to make adjustments flexibly for pitch and register. And then what happens there is we start weighing down the instrument. And then now we have to squeeze more. And then when we're squeezing more, now we have to get more breath pressure. We have to squeeze more from here. And it becomes this really bad chain effect all the way down the system or all the way up. And so there has to be a balance, but we also have to make sure that each part is learning to do its own job without interfering with the jobs of the other parts.
Yeah, that's great. And that snowball effect leads into negative emotions, which leads into the more desire to try and help. It's this, I cover this a lot, this idea of anything that's negative is going to typically lead singers towards more things that are negative and just keep reinforcing in the wrong direction, and vice versa. Why confident singers seem so rock solid is because everything they're doing is feeding into a positive cycle of trust and comfort and reliance, whatever it is, which leads to positive emotions, which leads to more trust and more openness in their personality and all this stuff. I love this idea because it is so key, and I think this is why you get these very clear kind of sets of singers that are just, they can't figure it out no matter what they do, and then you get singers who can't seem to go wrong no matter what they do, and it's like most of us have gone down one of those paths to one degree or another, depending on which way we've chosen, and depending on how far a singer's gone down the right path or the wrong path, can lead to very different results. I love what you said about this idea of things working in isolation and together, because it's exactly right. I talk about independence of muscle groups, learning to go up and down in pitch without messing around with anything else, ideas like this. But also you have this sense of, okay, so when I compress and lean into a deeper type of quality in the sound, the muscles that adjust the pitch feel like they have to work a bit harder all of a sudden to take me up and down. And so in that respect, there's a relationship between the muscle groups working. As I squeeze on one, the other works in the same way, but it might have to work a little bit more or less depending on. And so there's this idea of, like you say, everything's kind of working together as one unit, but then also in a sense in isolation. And it's tricky to to gradually understand, how all of those different things interact and create one cohesive voice. And one thing, really, the reason I mentioned scales when we started this topic was just the reason they can be useful for singers is because they help to simplify things and get us to a point where we're able to just change one thing at a time, which helps us to understand what using something in isolation, and then as we change what another variable, maybe as to a small amount, understanding how that can impact the other variable that we're trying to shift in isolation, things like that.
That's exactly how I describe it. Exactly like that. It simplifies things, and also you have that predictability of that pattern. I think really is helpful, because when you're encountering various pitch movements and intervals in a song, right, in a song melody, that makes it that much more challenging for us to figure out those little fine adjustments that we need to make when we're focusing on specifically one aspect of that functionality. So let's say it's a misbehaving tongue, which is really, really common. For us to be able to learn that, if you throw us back into lyrics and melody that's going all over the place in terms of pitch and register, it just makes it that much more difficult to tackle those little things and to work on them directly. So you bring it down, you simplify it into a much smaller pattern, shorter pattern, a more predictable pattern that you don't have to think about as much. A 5-note scale pattern, a 3-note scale pattern. It's really simple. But then what you're doing is you're training that muscle memory. You're training a new habit. You're building those new neural pathways so that when you do go back to singing that song, your tongue or whatever part you're working on it now has those neural pathways in place for correct function, for independence of function, but a function that works to help the rest of the system. And yeah, you have to just sometimes break it down without micromanaging. That's the big thing too, is we have to be really careful not to try to micromanage every aspect of our technique, because when we do that, that's when we start overthinking and we start tinkering too much and we start messing around with what might already be functioning perfectly well. And we get that a lot, I think, when we think really differently about singing versus speech. So most of us have good articulation patterns. Most of us use our jaws and our tongues effectively. We don't get tired. We don't put our tongues in weird spots. We don't try to depress them and pull them back and what have you. And then somehow when we go to singing, we think, oh, this is so different. Now I have to basically build a singing voice apart from normal articulatory function, which is really not a very good place to start from. But that's because we overthink and we think that's speech and that's song, and we separate those two. And we have to understand that we already have that function in place and we just have to build on it from there. So we start with speech, we start with normal function of those various parts, and then we grow from there. We enhance them. We don't alter significantly what we're doing. There are tweaks that we make. But do we say an E, for example, with the tongue flat? No, we don't. It's just not a natural posture for the tongue for that vowel. And so why would we think that taking a tongue depressor and flattening our tongue, which I've heard so many people do, why would we think that that is going to help the instrument function? All it does is flatten the tongue, push it back into the pharyngeal space, which then damps that resonance in there, and then it presses down on the hyoid bone, which in turn depresses the larynx. So there goes the functionality of that instrument, the free functioning of it. Now we have to go back and we have to try to undo everything that we've done, and it's a mess.
Yeah, well, I like the whole idea that I like to kind of push out to people a lot is a lot of the articulation. For the vast majority of people, they articulate words in a healthy, normal way, and so if you can do that already, really, it's not there shouldn't really be much difference. If I'm saying words when I sing, I don't really say them. In terms of the jaw and the tongue, I basically use them in the same way as I would when I talk. Like you say, there might be small things we want to do here and there, and certainly there's a place for opening the mouth a little wider than we typically would when we talk, things like that, depending on what style you're singing and what you want to do. But
and for pitch as well, higher as we go higher in pitch, and for intensity, there's definitely much more jaw lowering and mouth opening, two separate functions as well, mouth and jaw.
So outside of that, it should be a case of we're just trying to make some maybe small subtle adjustments, but broadly speaking, it should pretty much be left alone generally. And like you say, there's a lot of my kind of bugbear at the minute typically is trying to help people to get around this hyper amount of focus on a lot of surface details, and really try and get more down to the basic building blocks of a good voice versus a voice that is not going to interest people, and getting away from a lot of the details like the stylistic choices, or you've got to modify all these vowels up and do all these different weird funky things with the tongue to sound right. And I want to try and encourage people more towards just keep it simple. It's not that complicated if you get some basic skills right, and those basic skills aren't all the decoration on the cake, they are the sponge inside. And that kind of echoes or mirrors a little bit what you were talking about there anyway.
It's functional training. That's what we need. We're not trained to the styles in which we sing. I mean, to some extent we do, but initially we need to train function. We need to make sure that the instrument is operating freely and efficiently. Not all of the things that we sing or the ways in which we sing are going to be necessarily the most efficient, but they need to still be within the rules, I guess you can say, of the body's design, its natural way of functioning, what it's capable of doing in a sustained manner. There are lots of sounds that we're capable of making, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're intended to make them for extended periods of time. And so we have to also be very careful about, our voice use and how often we're using those kinds of sounds, and because they can have, effects on the instrument in the long term in terms of the wear and tear that we put on our instruments. But for the most part, I think if we're just going back to the function, getting the instrument to coordinate effectively and freely, that's our starting point from there. And the rest, you're right, is icing on the cake. It's just, it's just the decorative stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's do this last one, which was we've kind of covered this a little bit, but let's kind of hone in on it a bit. It is how emotions help or hinder singers, and I guess the bullet points I've got are low confidence and low self-esteem. What and how much impact do they have on a singer's chance of success? Let's kind of start there, but I guess it's this question of the emotional state that's going to be conducive to good healthy singing versus an emotional state that will lead towards, typically, like we were saying earlier, that snowball effect. From my perspective, my journey's been as much singing technique and as much personal change in a sense, because when I started I had generally quite low confidence, low self-esteem, and I was very fearful of other people, of myself, basically a negative person. And over the years I've had this battle in my head trying to transition and let go of that person I used to be, and more towards somebody that has more optimistic, more can-do attitude, and as my skills have developed, my confidence has grown, so that stuff tended to go hand in hand. But I'm interested in if you've had any personal experience with this, and if it's something that you go through with students, or you experience with students that are harder cases, things like that.
Most definitely. I would say that our psychological and emotional health has a direct impact on our body's ability to coordinate effectively. And I always use the example of, you try to sing while you're crying, right? I mean, that's an extreme, expression of that emotion, of that sadness. But if you try to, everything gets choked off, the tone gets throttled, and it's almost impossible to get the words out, right? Let alone a good, pleasant tone. And, you know, if you go to the opposite end, right, when you're experiencing joy and laughter, when you laugh, everything just kind of releases, right? When you're whooping and hollering at a sports team, woohoo, right? You can go up these high pitches and you don't think about it. You're not micromanaging. You're not trying to coordinate. You're not thinking I'm singing, right? You're just making sounds and you're using your voice very expressively. And when you're using your voice and you're basing that on positive emotions, the slight smile, even that little lift, it's more of a, I mean, we talk more about that in classical circles, right? That little lift of the zygomatic musculature up underneath the eyes, a little smile under the eyes. And it's thought to be associated with the lifting of the soft palate, and they're not really connected by muscular attachment in any way. But I think what that does is it cues the brain. When you get that pleasant expression on your face, the brain starts to send different signals to the body to say, this is a good experience. This is a good activity. This is fun. This brings you joy. And if you're somebody who really struggles with, depression, with clinical depression, for example, if you've ever experienced that, there's this almost a sense of weight and heaviness that's always on you. And the energy's just not there. Like to try to get your voice to really move when there's that emotional weight sitting on you all the time. I mean, that's again another extreme, but so many of us are trying to sing from that place where there's stress in our lives. There's a lot of negative emotion, and we're trying to lift our voices like that. And it's really hard. It's really hard to get the voice to coordinate in ways that we want it to. And on one hand we want to, but on the other hand we just can't pull ourselves up out of that. I've definitely been there many times in my life where it's just that sense of heaviness, an emotional heaviness. And it's really hard to sing and to really explore your voice fully and all the qualities and textures and all those emotions in a song when everything is just weighing you down.
Yeah, my experience was, and what I try and help people with a lot of the time is just a starting point for exercises sometimes. Is just to encourage people to stay calm. I mean, it sounds so simple, but that ability to panic, for some people, it's not as there as others, but some people panic so quickly and easily, and they don't even realize they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so immediately, you stay mum, 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 mum. And immediately before they even start, be like, this sense of, just that is like, that start point, you already know that the exercise isn't going to work that well. Versus somebody that's not, somebody that's more of a natural or that's not struggling so much, they just do it. In their head, they're calm. They're not panicking. And that fight or flight response is what typically will engage with singers who are in that negative spiral, is they panic. And that panic, like you said, literally inhibits the voice from working. And it can do to the extent where it's actually really almost impossible to sing pleasant sounding noises, really, because there's so much inhibition in the sound. And that's what I was referring to really at the start of the lesson is this not lesson, sorry, I've been teaching before this, so I'm still like in coaching mode. Is this sense of when we're singing within the right limits and the wrong limits, and that inhibition and that grab tends to put us into this place where people are just going to switch off because it's not open and calm. It's constrained, controlled, and inhibited. Just like when you see a dancer, and they're kind of like this on the dance floor, very uncomfortable, and then you see the professional guys on TV, and they are like loose and all over the place, and they are calm and comfortable and confident.
Well,
It's easy to do when you're very good at singing. It's harder to do when you suck, and when you are loose and free, you make a lot of mistakes. And that goes back to some of the stuff with perspective and things we were talking about earlier. But you've got to stay calm and just try and instill a habit of remaining as calm as you can and not allowing that panic mechanism to run away, which it so easily can if you're a struggling singer.
and taking the pressure off yourself. I think that's a big thing, because we have this expectation again that we should be over here, but we're only over here. And then we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves. You know, we need to be singing like that. We need to be able to belt. We need to be able to sing high. We need to be able to, whatever it might be. And we don't stay in the moment and say, this is where I'm at now. And what are the steps that I need to take to get me there? And just be content with being here now, even though that's not where you want to be ultimately, but just living in that moment of your development is really important. And I like to resort to trickery sometimes. I like to trick the body into doing the things that it's designed to do, but that are being, I don't know, our inhibitions, our emotions, or our negative or counterproductive thought processes are getting in our way of doing that. And so, like I said, even just those sounds that we make, those primal or those instinctual sounds that we make, the whooping and the hollering and the laughter and all of that, right? Because again, we're not thinking about how our bodies are coordinating. We're not overthinking it. We're not trying to micromanage anything. And then sometimes when we'll do a whoop or something and say, see, you can do it. You don't trust yourself. You don't trust yourself. You don't trust your body to be able to do this, but it can do it. You just have to get out of your own way. And it's easier said than done. Absolutely easier said than done. Some of my best singing happens when I'm slightly distracted. Not when I'm driving and I need to focus on safety and getting my kids to and from places without getting into an accident. But when I'm preparing dinner is when I do the bulk of my practicing, just because it's really the only time I have. So yes, there are sharp knives and hot oil involved, but I'm not so distracted that it's dangerous, but I'm not directly focusing on singing and thinking about my technique and thinking about the fact that that part is coming up in the song that I know is a struggle for me. And, am I going to be able to sing that? And am I going to like the sound of this? I'm not thinking about that. I'm just singing and I'm practicing and I'm singing full out and I'm doing what I need to do to keep moving forward in my own training. And the voice just sort of figures it out because I'm not getting in my own way. I'm not trying to make things happen. And I'm not thinking about whether or not I trust my instrument to cooperate when I want it to cooperate. And that's really sometimes the most effective practicing time for me. I have other times when I am being very deliberate and very focused and very methodical in how I'm approaching my singing. I sit down and I know I've got a very clear focus, training focus for that time. I'm working on this specific aspect of my technique. But the rest of the time when I'm doing a lot of my singing, that's when I'm just let it come out, not overthinking it. And the voice just releases. And that's when I tend to like my voice the most. That's when I find my real voice, is when I stop trying to make it into something that I think it's supposed to be, that I feel like others are expecting it to be.
Yeah. I got this. I had very similar experiences, and also my sense is when I'm practicing on some details in practice time, I will have some conscious adjustments I'm making. Those adjustments need to be relatively subtle and this sense of you directing your voice, nudging it in a certain direction or in another direction, as opposed to work, do what I want you to do type. And then when we go to sing and perform, or even just when we're singing, straight through songs whilst listening to music, it is this sense of unconscious. We trust the work we've put in, and that those coordinations are there enough that we can just let them work unconsciously, just like when we walk down the street. And that's the best place to be for a singer, is you don't have to think about it anymore. And yeah, I tend to think about it as conscious practice and then unconscious performance, and try and there's obviously going to be a little bit of crossover here and there, and there's times when you'll have to employ a little bit of both depending on what you're doing. So I have different types of practice strategies actually. So I'll have sometimes where I'm focusing on a lot of details, and then other times where I'm just going through whole songs in my practice without stopping. And then other times, obviously, when I actually perform, is when I'm just forced to go through and execute as best I can. And in those situations, the mental tool set you have is going to be slightly more angled towards the unconscious trust versus when it's more mechanical practice, when it's going to be a little bit more conscious. You have the same thing in learning guitar and stuff like that, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the very start of all this. Right, I've got to go very soon. That was very enjoyable, Karyn. I really appreciate this. It's been a great chat, and I love that we've got so much common ground here. I put on here closing thoughts, thank yous, channels, plugs, goodbyes. But I don't know if I've really got any closing thoughts other than to say thank you for the chat, and hopefully we can do another one of these maybe in a few months or something, and we'll pick up again and see where we're at. Yeah, do you have anything you want to kind of finish up with?
No, I think, we said a lot. I think just speaking from my own experience for anybody who's in my position or my former position is just, yeah, sometimes just trusting your instrument. That's something that I've definitely had to learn, is just trusting that it's capable sometimes of so much more than we give it credit for. I think that's a big thing, because I think that's what gets in so many singers' way, is just really having so many doubts, so much self-doubt. And also, and when we're screwing up, when things aren't sounding good the ways we want them to sound, just that self-deprecation that's just, when I was younger, I mean, I had so much, we'll say, fear of man, right? So much worry about what people were going to think of my voice, what people were going to think of me on stage. Do I look good? Am I dressed right? Am I moving awkwardly? Do I look right? Do I look, am I moving right? Do I sound right? Am I, just all these thoughts that used to get in my head that used to just be such a distraction for me.
Yeah.
And learning to be able to just, again, say, what do I have to lose in just letting go and letting this come out of me in the form of a voice? And I think that was, for me, was the biggest thing, was just, and it's still a struggle for me, because just my personality, my own temperament. I am an introvert by nature, and I am still reserved, and that hasn't changed significantly from when I was younger. But just, I think my perspective on everything in life has changed a lot over the past, 20 some odd years of singing more seriously. And I just, allowing that, those inhibitions, just allowing them to slowly dissipate, slowly go away. It's a process.
Yeah, it's in terms of what you're saying about the, allowing yourself to room to succeed. I've just put here, allowing yourself to be great at what you do. I think in some sense, being a great singer is harder than being an average singer in some ways. It requires more openness in who you are, what you have to offer, in your most basic qualities as a human. And those qualities vary from person to person. Like, the way I sing is a reflection of who I am, and that's the same for everyone. If they're singing in their most honest way, they will have a different angle on this than the other people, because those instincts and that nature they were born with is a little bit different for them than it will be for other people. And the more you allow that to come out, you kind of got to be very open with who you are and comfortable with that, and it's not necessarily an easy thing. And yeah, like you said, that kind of comes back to allowing yourself to be yourself. Really, it's like without all of that self-talk going on, and ironically, all of that self-talk is what creates that uncomfortability with the audience, and them feeling uncomfortable. Whereas if you're just yourself and you're completely comfortable with that on stage, even if you're not that good, people will tend to latch onto it a lot more than they will if you are technically a decent singer but you're very uncomfortable. And that's what I found recently, is that I don't even need to sing that well, but if I'm open in what I'm doing, people will connect with it a lot more than if I am uncomfortable and trying to be technically great at what I do. Like, if I'm uncomfortable, it's like you can't get around that. The calm, confident, comfortable person has to be really the bedrock of where you're doing, where you're allowing yourself to be yourself.
And I always tell my students as they're just entering into the performance, arena, that there's so much more that goes into a good performance than just stellar vocals. I mean, there is that ability to be able to be yourself, be comfortable in your own skin, because you're right. That can make an audience really uncomfortable when they see that you're uncomfortable. And just being able to really connect with them on a deeply emotional level. The audience really, what the audience wants more than anything is to feel invited in, to feel like it's part of that whole performance, in some vicarious manner even, but to feel as though it's being invited in. Because if it's not, then there's this sense that you're just sort of singing to yourself and you're here, and it becomes very uncomfortable to watch, because it's like almost like a private moment on stage where it's like, why am I watching this? It becomes very uncomfortable for the audience, definitely. And I find that, with my students, one of the biggest things I think that hinders their progress is that fear of embarrassment, fear of making a bad sound or an ugly sound, fear of, just even in front of their teacher. It's a private setting where it's just the two of you, but that gets in the way of their being able to allow their bodies to coordinate effectively and to trust their instrument. And so I always try to make sure that students coming to me feel as though, again, it's easier said than done, but feel as though, it's a safe place. I've heard it all. I've heard every sound under the sun, beautiful and not so beautiful. And I'm not there to judge or to make fun. I'm there to help them, to help guide them along that journey to getting to the place where they want to go to. And sometimes even just stating that up front and saying, listen, I know you're nervous. I know you're afraid of the sounds that you're going to make. I know you don't like your voice. I know you don't think you're a very good singer, but I'm just here to help you. That's all I'm here for, is to just help guide you step by step in getting to the point where you are feeling more confident. And sometimes that just kind of, it takes the pressure off of them, because I understand. I was nervous in front of my teacher for 4 years. I just, I was always afraid of making, because I'm such a control freak. I'm very OCD, and I want to control my sound. I want to make sure it's right and it's good and it sounds pretty and it sounds polished and it sounds perfect, and that's my personality. That's who I am. And being able to let go and just get out of that, it's a huge struggle that can take many, many years, but it's worth it when you start to slowly lose those inhibitions. You slowly come out of that shell. It's not going to happen overnight.
And I bet you that's helped you day to day in terms of how you interact with the world. That's what I've found anyway. Because those tendencies taken too far can be very damaging. Not yours in particular, but just generally in human beings. If our a lot of those natural instincts that people have, they can be channeled in a positive way, or they can be taken so far that they start to become like a straitjacket for people. And like singing can help people to temper those instincts some and understand them more objectively. And and just to finish up what you were saying about the stage thing, really as a singer, I guess my view is you're setting the emotional tone, and people are looking to be led emotionally when you're on stage. So whatever you feel, if you're uncomfortable, that is what people are absorbing. If you're uncomfortable and technically good, they're still absorbing the uncomfortable emotions that you're putting out, and vice versa. If you're very comfortable emotionally, that's what they're going to draw from. And it's like you're really an emotional leader as a singer on stage. You are putting out preferably open, calm, confident emotions, and being really open in who you are and people want to suck and draw that into themselves and really connect on that level beyond, you know, politics and all that stuff. More often than not, it's those very basic things that people have inside them that they want to draw from. And that wall, when we've got all that fear and stuff and self-talk and doubt, that's what just disconnects it all. And yeah, it goes deep, all this stuff. It goes deep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like, for me, I think it wasn't until recent years that I realized that I was wearing that straitjacket for so many years. It just
Yeah.
really took, I think, getting a little bit older, to be honest. I think getting to that point again where I feel like, what do I have to lose? You know, where but it took years for me to get to that point where I realized, oh my goodness, if only I had 20 years ago allowed more of this to come out.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to micromanage and control every single aspect of my technique and every aspect of my performance and every aspect of my life, and just allowed, you know, the intensity that is in there, even though I'm reserved and I'm introverted, you know, and I'm not very assertive or aggressive person, it's still in there. There's a lot of intensity in there that I just don't show. And if only, you know, in hindsight, right, I'm looking back at myself from 20 years ago thinking, if only I had just, you know, let more of that out, where would it have taken me? You know, where would I have gone with my performance? I mean, I felt like I was just kind of, yeah, sort of at that, I kind of stayed at this easy level for me, this, you know, safe place. And just imagining if I had just harnessed and released that, if I had just, what level would I have gotten to back then? And I wished I'd found this out earlier, but at least I've come to that point where I've had that sort of epiphany.
Well, you're lucky you found it out at all. A lot of people will go through their lives and not find out any of this stuff. I feel blessed, but I also empathise with that a lot because I often my sense was that as a child I was like this, and then somehow I lost it on the way through my teens and early adult life, and then I've just been in a quest to get back to emotionally in a lot of ways where I was when I was very young, into that just open, calm spot. Not to say I'm trying to be a child, but there's certain parts that kids have that are often lost as you grow up, and I think sometimes to people's detriment. I think there's an open quality that you have to search for again if you want to find some success as a singer, if you're learning as an adult. And like you say, it can be a challenge, and it can, very much so, feel like, A, how did I miss this because it seems so simple, and B, you know, if only I've known. And it's great. I mean, I feel like if I'd have lived any other life, you know, I would have just gone through my entire life without knowing any of this at all, and then I would have been more confused than I am now. So, you know, it's a good thing, really, but there can be some frustration in that sense. I totally get that, and I have it often when I find singers who I really like, and I think, oh man, why did I have it so hard? But yeah, it's just part of life, really.
Well, I'm glad you brought up these topics, though, because they're actually near and dear to my heart for a lot of reasons, because of my own struggles with, you know, being able to kind of find myself and my own voice, and everything that I've gone through as a singer in trying to become who I'm supposed to be. But also my background is actually in psychology and counseling. Those are my degrees, and I'm certified in counseling. And how I ended up in the US 16 years ago was to work as a counselor in a private psychiatric hospital. So I feel like I've almost come full circle in some ways back to my original education and training and career, where I feel like so much of that, I draw from so much of that in working with my students, because I see so much of that, so much of those things that in here and here that are just standing in their way of really becoming the singers that they're capable of becoming, but don't know it yet.
Yeah, that's probably why we've got a lot of common ground as well, on top of the gymnastics and the sports, is that my mum was a business coach, basically, or a life coach, and does counselling and stuff. And so in my early 20s, when I was struggling, she started going through a lot of this stuff with me, and so I started to get really into, you know, all of this deeper level stuff that can go on. And it's a good match, sport and, you know, this well, you know, you could self-help or you know, kind of understanding the mind on a more deeper level and how individuals work and things like this. It all kind of connects up. It connects up a lot of dots for people. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so very much for having me. I really enjoyed this whole chat that we had here, and I'll definitely have to have you on my channel. We'll do another video together. I really look forward to that.
So, awesome, man. We'll see you again. Take care,
Sounds good.
guys.
All right. Take care.
Cool.